So when we look at respiratory control, we need to revise that the peripheral and the alveolar capillaries are maintaining the gas diffusion, and they maintain that gas diffusion by changes in blood flow and oxygen delivery and changes in depth and rate of respiration. So the local regulation of gas transport and alveolar function is as the result of rising levels of carbon dioxide. This results in smooth muscles relaxing in the arterioles and the capillaries and an increase in blood flow. And the coordination of lung perfusion and alveolar ventilation shifts blood flow. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide controls bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation, which is why swimmers, professional swimmers, when they're swimming laps and laps, they can actually swim for longer because they have a build-up of carbon dioxide which causes bronchodilation. The respiratory centers are located in the brain, so when the demand for oxygen rises, the cardiac output and the respiratory rate increases under neural or brain control. And we have both voluntary and involuntary components. So we're going to have a look at those. So the voluntary centers in the cerebral cortex affect, so we've got the respiratory centers of the pons and the medulla oblongata. I've got a diagram to show you in just a minute. And the motor neurons that control the respiratory muscles. Then you've got the respiratory center, and these are three pairs of nuclei in the reticular formation of the medulla oblongata and the pons, and they regulate the respiratory muscles in response to sensory information via the respiratory reflexes. So here's the brain. We haven't done the brain in the topic, but I'm showing you this because of the important parts of the brain and the control of respiration. So you can see that it is has the coloured lobes are there, so you can see the names, but what we're wanting you to look at is the bit underneath, the brown bits underneath, the bit called the pons and the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is the long bit coming off the bottom, and underneath the brain is the bit where it's called the pons. And this is where the respiratory centres are located. So the respiratory center of the medulla oblongata, this sets the pace for respiration, and it can be divided into two groups. You've got the dorsal respiratory group, known in the brackets DRG, and the ventral respiratory group, called VRG. So the dorsal respiratory group is responsible for the inspiratory center and functions when there is quiet and forced breathing. The ventral respiratory group is responsible for inspiratory and expiratory center, but it functions only in forced breathing. So when we're breathing quietly, there is a brief activity in the dorsal respiratory group, and this stimulates inspiratory muscles, and then the dorsal respiratory group become inactive and it allows passive exhalation. So this is occurring every time you breathe. So if we look at this box diagram, so with quiet breathing, you have an inhalation that lasts for 2 seconds and an exhalation that lasts for 3 seconds. So if we start at the top of the box, which says diaphragm and external intercostal muscles contract and inhalation occurs, then we follow the blue arrow, and then the dorsal respiratory group is inhibited, and the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles relax, and passive exhalation occurs. After that, we have the dorsal respiratory group active, which results in the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles contracting and inhalation occurs. And so it goes on and on. Forced breathing is when you've got increased activity in the dorsal respiratory group, and this stimulates the ventral respiratory group, which activates the accessory inspiratory muscles. So it's when you're under a lot of duress or you've done a lot of activity. After inhalation, the expiratory center neurons actively stimulate exhalation. So here we've got forced breathing. So again, starting up the top where you've got inhalation. So the muscles of inhalation contract and the opposing muscles relax and inhalation occurs. So air moves from the external environment into the lungs. The dorsal respiratory group and the inspiratory center of the ventral respiratory group are inhibited, and the expiratory center of the ventral respiratory group is active. This results in the muscles of inhalation relaxing and the muscles of exhalation contracting, and we get a forced exhalation occurring. Then we get the dorsal respiratory and the inspiratory center of the ventral respiratory group are active, and the inspiratory center of the ventral respiratory group is inhibited. And so it goes back up to inhalation. So the respiratory center and the respiratory, the reflex controls, their interactions, as you can see, between the ventral respiratory group and the dorsal respiratory group. And this establishes the basic pattern and depth of breathing. But we also have another center called the pneumotaxic center, and this modifies the pace. So where is this pneumotaxic center located? It's located in the pons. So it's you can see what we've got here is a really large drawing, a close-up drawing of the brain. So we've got the medulla oblongata, which is heading down the bottom of the drawing, and the bump in the middle is the pons, and inside the pons you've got the pneumotaxic center and the apneuristic center. So these are the higher centers which are involved in controlling part of respiration. And these pathways are for conscious control over respiratory. So here we've got, you can see that diagram. If I just go back again, what we've got is this diagram. We've pulled back a little bit, and then we've got the, you can see here, we've got the dorsal groups and the ventral groups in that blue circle or the blue oval, and then there are two smaller blue ovals. That's located in the medulla oblongata. Next to the medulla oblongata, you've got the 9th and 10th nerve coming off, and these nerves are responsible for sending back impulses from the chemoreceptors and the baroreceptors of the carotid and the aortic sinuses. So they are located within the blood vessels. Then you have the 10th nerve, which is located around the lungs, and that is involved in picking up the stretch receptors. Then off the spinal cord, you've also got motor neurons that are controlling the diaphragm. One of those is the phrenic nerve. So you can see that there's a lot of involvement in nerves for breathing. So if we look at the respiratory reflexes, so the chemoreceptors are sensitive to changes in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the partial pressure of oxygen, or the change in the pH of blood or cerebrospinal fluid. So they're very sensitive. The baroreceptors are located in the aortic or the carotid sinuses, and they're sensitive to changes in blood pressure, because of course they're located in big blood vessels. The stretch receptors respond to changes in lung volume. You can get irritation or physical or chemical stimulation in the nose cavity, the larynx, or the bronchial tree, and that can also trigger a reflex. Other sensations, including pain and changes in body temperature and abnormal visceral sensations, can also trigger respiratory reflexes. So the chemoreceptor reflexes, let's have a look more at those. So the respiratory centers are strongly influenced by the chemoreceptor input, and this is from the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is the 9th cranial nerve, and the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve. And the central chemoreceptors, they also monitor the cerebrospinal fluid. So if you get changes in carbon dioxide there will be a change in respiratory function. So the glossopharyngeal nerve, the 9th cranial nerve, from the carotid bodies in the carotid artery, is stimulated by changes in blood pH or partial pressure of oxygen. The vagus nerve from the aortic body in the aorta is stimulated by changes in blood pH or partial pressure of oxygen. So the chemoreceptor reflexes, these are the central chemoreceptors that monitor the central cerebrospinal fluid. Remember, the cerebrospinal fluid is the clear fluid that bathes the brain, so it would be the first change in the cerebrospinal fluid that would be sending that message to the brain. And they're on the ventrolateral surface of the medulla oblongata, and they respond to changes in carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and also the changes in pH of the cerebrospinal fluid. So chemoreceptor stimulation, if we get a stimulation, it leads to an increase in the depth and the rate of respiration, and it's subject to adaptation. So if you have a person who's got a pathology like chronic obstructive airways disease, their body is always functioning with a high level of carbon dioxide, then their sensitivity to stimulation can be decreased over time. With a condition called hypercapnia, so increase in partial pressure of arterial carbon dioxide, you get it stimulates the chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata to restore homeostasis. You can have hypercapnia or you can have hypocapnia. So hypoventilation is the common cause of hypercapnia, increased levels of carbon dioxide. Or abnormally low respiratory rate allows the carbon dioxide to build up in the blood. But also excessive ventilation, so hyperventilation, can result in abnormally low levels of carbon dioxide because the hyperventilation, the person breathing so fast, blows off, expires out too much carbon dioxide. And this stimulates the chemoreceptors to decrease the respiratory rate. So if we look at it diagrammatically, we're going to start from the purple circle where it says start, and what we're looking at here is how the chemoreceptors respond to a change in the partial pressures of carbon dioxide. So here we've got an increase in arterial carbon dioxide. So we've got homeostasis, so everything is working well. We've got normal arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And now we get a rise, and that homeostasis is disturbed. We've got an increase in arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide from hypocapnia. This results in the stimulation of the arterial chemoreceptors, and this increases the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the cerebrospinal fluid, which also causes a decrease in pH. So with the pH, if it's decreasing, is becoming more acidic. Both of these result in the stimulation of the respiratory muscles, and an increase in cerebrospinal fluid chemical receptors at the medulla oblongata will also cause a stimulation of the respiratory muscles. This stimulation causes an increase in respiratory rate, and this increase in respiratory rate eliminates that rise in partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli, and now homeostasis is restored because we're back down to normal arterial pressure of partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So we can see how that feedback cycle begins. If we look now, so that was looking at an increased arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Next, we're going to look at a decrease in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So again, we're going to start off at the purple circle, and we're following the arrows around. So homeostasis, the body's in balance, normal arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Then we move to a disturbed situation. Homeostasis is disturbed, and in this situation we have a decrease in arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide from hypocapnia. This results in a decrease in carbon dioxide, an increase in the pH, and this is detected in the cerebrospinal fluid. This causes an inhibition of the arterial chemoreceptors. This in turn causes an inhibition of the respiratory muscles, and also the CSF, which has been altered, that causes a reduction in the stimulation of the CSF chemoreceptors. So together they result in the inhibition of respiratory muscles. So this decreases the respiratory rate, and with that decreased respiratory rate, you get the elimination of carbon dioxide at the alveoli. And then we have respiratory homeostasis restored, normal arterial carbon dioxide levels in the arterial blood is restored. So baroreceptor reflexes, so this is pressure. So these are located in the carotid and the aortic baroreceptor stimulation. This causes an effect of blood pressure and respiratory centers. So when blood pressure falls, respiration increases. When blood pressure increases, respiratory rate decreases. So we have some protective reflexes as well, and these are triggered by the receptors in the epithelium of the respiratory tract when the lungs are exposed to toxic vapors, chemical irritants, and mechanical stimuli, and it causes sneezing, coughing, and laryngeal spasm. So it's trying to stop these irritants from entering the respiratory system. Apnea is a period of suspended respiration, normally followed by an explosive exhalation to clear the airway, such as sneezing or coughing. Laryngeal spasm is the temporary closing of the airway to prevent the foreign substances from entering. So the voluntary control of respiration, so strong emotions can stimulate respiratory centers in the hypothalamus. So a shock or excessive happiness or sadness, so emotional stress can activate the sympathetic or the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and this can result in bronchodilation or bronchoconstriction. So people with asthma, if they get very, very upset, can get an exacerbation of their asthma, but likewise if they've got asthma and they laugh a lot, that can also bring on an asthma episode. So the anticipation of strenuous exercise can also increase respiratory rate and cardiac output by sympathetic stimulation.